In 1989, a special education school bus carrying 8 children with autism, their dedicated teacher and their beloved driver disappeared during what should have been a carefully planned field trip to the Science Museum. Before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more stories like this one. These weren't ordinary students. They required extra care, routine, and understanding. Their teacher, Miss Amanda Thompson, had spent months preparing them for this special day, working with each child to help them feel comfortable with the change in routine. Their families had fought hard to give them this opportunity for a normal childhood experience. But when the bus never arrived at its destination, 10 souls vanished without a trace. For 18 years, their families endured not just the agony of loss, but also the cruel whispers about whether their different children had somehow wandered off or been abandoned. Until a road construction crew working on a highway expansion project made a discovery underground that would finally reveal the horrifying truth about what happened to these innocent children and their devoted teacher that October morning and prove that evil doesn't discriminate. October 15th, 1989. Riverside Elementary School in Cedar Falls, Iowa buzzed with excitement as 8 special education students prepared for their long-awaited field trip to the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. For months, 26-year-old Miss Amanda Thompson had been working tirelessly with her students, each child with autism requiring individualized preparation for what would be a significant change to their daily routine. 7-year-old Marcus Williams rocked gently in his seat, clutching his favorite red toy truck, the same one he carried everywhere for comfort. 8-year-old Emma Chen carefully arranged her colored pencils in perfect rows, just as she did every morning. 9-year-old Tyler Brooks repeated the museum's address over and over. 57th Street, 57th Street, 57th Street. Each child had their own way of processing the world, and Amanda understood every single one of them. The preparation had been extensive. Amanda had shown them pictures of the museum, walked them through the route they'd take, even practiced sitting quietly on chairs, arranged like bus seats. She'd coordinated with each family, ensuring dietary restrictions were noted, comfort items were packed, and emergency medications were readily available. Remember, we stay together as a group, Amanda reminded them as they lined up. Mr. Jerry will drive us safely and we'll see amazing things today. Gerald Jerry Martinez, 54, had been driving school buses for over 20 years. The children adored him. He always kept his bus immaculately clean, played soft music that didn't overwhelm sensitive ears, and had learned each child's name within the first week of school. Jerry understood that these weren't typical students. He drove slower, took wider turns, and always announced each stop before making it. At exactly 8:30 a.m., the yellow bus pulled away from Riverside Elementary. Security cameras captured the moment. Amanda waving from the front seat, Jerry's careful navigation through the parking lot, and the children's excited faces pressed against the windows. It would be the last confirmed sighting of any of them, alive. But what the cameras didn't capture was the black sedan that had been following the bus since it left the school. A sedan driven by someone who had been watching, planning, and waiting for exactly this opportunity. The Chicago Museum of Science and Industry had been expecting the group at 10:30 a.m. Museum Education Coordinator Linda Patterson stood by the main entrance, clipboard in hand, watching for the distinctive yellow bus from Cedar Falls. 10:30 came and went. 11 o'clock. 11:30. At 11:45, Linda called Riverside Elementary. "This is Linda Patterson at the Science Museum. We're still waiting for the Thompson group. Has there been a delay?" Principal Robert Hayes felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean waiting? They should have been there over an hour ago." The next call went to the Illinois State Police, then to Iowa authorities. Within 2 hours, a multi-state search was underway, but the yellow school bus had seemingly vanished into thin air. Back in Cedar Falls, parents began gathering at the school. Margaret Williams, Marcus's mother, clutched her son's backup red truck, identical to the one he'd taken on the trip. "He needs this," she kept saying. "When he comes back, he'll need this." The Chen family had driven from 3 towns over to enroll Emma in this special program. David Chen, Emma's father, stood silent in the parking lot, staring at the exact spot where he'd watched the bus disappear that morning. His wife, Susan, made call after call to relatives, hoping against hope that somehow Emma had found her way to safety. Tyler Brooks's grandmother, Dorothy, had raised him since his parents died in a car accident when he was 3. At 72, she'd learned to navigate his autism, his need for routine, his brilliant memory for numbers and addresses. "He knows our phone number," she told police. "He knows our address. If he could call, he would call." As evening fell, the harsh reality began to set in. The bus hadn't broken down. There hadn't been an accident on any major highway between Cedar Falls and Chicago. Somehow, 10 people had simply vanished. But in a small truck stop 120 miles south of Cedar Falls, a mechanic named Roy Brennan was closing up shop when he noticed something odd. Fresh yellow paint streaks on the concrete floor of Bay 3, the bay that had been rented by a man who paid cash and gave a fake name. The same bay where a yellow school bus had been repainted forest green just hours earlier. Roy thought about calling the police, but the man who'd rented the bay had been convincing. And the envelope of cash sitting in Roy's pocket was more money than he'd make in 6 months. So Roy said nothing, swept up the paint chips, and tried to forget what he'd seen. The investigation into the missing bus consumed 3 states. FBI agents descended on Cedar Falls, treating the school as a crime scene. Every inch of the planned route was searched. Helicopter patrols scanned forests, fields, and waterways. The story dominated local news for weeks. Detective Sarah Montgomery led the Cedar Falls investigation. She'd worked missing persons cases before, but nothing like this. 8 vulnerable children, their teacher, and their driver, all gone without a trace. "Someone doesn't just make a school bus disappear," she told her partner, Detective Frank Russo. "It's 40 feet long, bright yellow, and has the school's name painted on the side. Somebody saw something." They were right. Dozens of people had seen something. The problem was, what they'd seen didn't make sense. A gas station attendant in Davenport reported serving a man driving a green bus with Iowa plates around noon on October 15th. But the man had been alone. No children, no teacher, no second driver. A farmer outside Moline claimed he'd seen a yellow school bus pulled over on a rural road around 10 a.m. But when he'd driven by again an hour later, it was gone. Most puzzling of all was the report from truck driver Bill Hansen. He swore he'd seen a school bus being loaded onto a flatbed truck at a rest stop near the Illinois-Indiana border. "But it was painted green," he told investigators. "And there was nobody around it except 2 men in coveralls." The FBI brought in their best profilers. The working theory was kidnapping. But why these particular children? Special needs students weren't typical targets for ransom demands. Their families, while loving and devoted, weren't wealthy. Amanda Thompson was fresh out of college, drowning in student loans. Jerry Martinez lived in a modest apartment and sent most of his salary to his elderly mother in Mexico. Weeks turned to months. The yellow bus never surfaced. No ransom demands were made. No bodies were found. It was as if 10 people had simply ceased to exist. The families refused to give up. They organized search parties, distributed flyers, and held press conferences. Margaret Williams appeared on every local news show that would have her, always holding Marcus's backup red truck. "He's alive," she would say. "I know my son is alive." But as winter turned to spring, and spring turned to summer, even the most dedicated volunteers began to lose hope. The case went cold. The FBI closed their field office in Cedar Falls. Life, slowly and painfully, began to move on. Except for Amanda Thompson's sister, Rebecca. She couldn't let go. Every weekend, Rebecca drove the route from Cedar Falls to Chicago, stopping at every gas station, every truck stop, every roadside diner, showing pictures and asking questions. She'd taken a leave of absence from her job as a nurse, using her savings to fund her private investigation. "You need to accept that she's gone," her husband Tom pleaded. "This is consuming you." But Rebecca had found something the police had missed. In a diner bathroom in Morris, Illinois, scratched into the paint of a bathroom stall, she'd found a message. "AT, help us. They took us. AT, Amanda Thompson." Rebecca called Detective Montgomery immediately. "I found something. I think I found something." But when they returned to the diner the next day, the stall had been repainted. The message was gone. The diner's owner, a nervous man named Pete Kowalski, claimed he knew nothing about any message, said he'd had the bathroom painted that very morning. Just coincidence. Detective Montgomery didn't believe in coincidences. But without the physical evidence, without the message, she had nothing. 18 years passed. The missing bus case remained open, but inactive. Detective Montgomery had retired. Most of the original investigators had moved on or passed away. The families had struggled through grief, some finding a way to heal, others remaining frozen in that October morning of 1989. Margaret Williams had never remarried. She kept Marcus's room exactly as he'd left it, his backup red truck sitting on the dresser. Every October 15th, she drove to Riverside Elementary, now closed and converted to senior housing, and stood in the parking lot, remembering. Dorothy. Brooks had died in 2003, never knowing what happened to her grandson Tyler. The Chen family had moved to California, seeking a fresh start, but carrying their grief across the country. And then, on a crisp morning in March 2007, everything changed. Highway construction crews were working on a major expansion of Interstate 80, about 85 miles south of Cedar Falls. The project involved adding 2 lanes and modernizing the roadway, work that required extensive excavation. Foreman Jake Sullivan was overseeing the demolition of an old overpass when his crew's excavator struck something unexpected. 23 feet underground. At first, they thought it was a water main or old sewer line. But as they cleared away more dirt and debris, they realized they were looking at metal. Painted metal. "Stop the machine," Jake called out, climbing down into the excavation site. What he saw made his blood run cold. It was the roof of a vehicle, a large vehicle, and as more earth was cleared away, the distinctive became unmistakable. It was a bus, a school bus that had been buried under tons of concrete and soil. Jake's hands shook as he called 911. "This is Jake Sullivan with Midwest Construction. I need to report the discovery of what appears to be a school bus buried at our worksite. And, God help me, I think there might be people inside." Within hours, the construction site was swarming with police, FBI agents, and forensic teams. The excavation was painstakingly careful. Investigators knew they were potentially dealing with a crime scene that had been preserved underground for nearly 2 decades. The bus had been painted green, just as truck driver Bill Hansen had reported, all those years ago. But more chilling was its position. It sat upright in what appeared to be a carefully constructed underground chamber, as if it had been driven into a massive hole and then buried alive. FBI forensics specialist Dr. Maria Santos led the recovery effort. She'd worked disaster sites and mass casualties, but nothing had prepared her for what they found as they cleared the dirt from the bus windows. The children were still in their seats. After 18 years underground, in the climate-controlled environment created by the concrete and soil, the scene was horrifically well preserved. 8 small bodies, still wearing their field trip clothes, sitting exactly where they'd been when the bus had been buried. Their teacher, Amanda Thompson, sat in the front seat, her arms wrapped around the closest child, as if trying to comfort him even in death. Jerry Martinez, the bus driver, was slumped over the wheel. But unlike the others, Jerry's body showed signs of struggle. His hands were bloodied, his fingernails broken, as if he'd clawed desperately at something, or someone. The bus doors were chained shut from the outside. They were buried alive, Dr. Santos whispered, her professional composure cracking. Someone drove this bus into a hole and buried them alive. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. Scratched into the metal walls of the bus, investigators found messages, desperate pleas for help, carved with keys, coins, anything the victims could find. "Help us, trapped. Someone please find us. Marcus, scared," in a child's uncertain letters. "Tell my family I love them, A.T." The messages told a story of unimaginable horror. The victims had survived the initial burial. They'd tried to escape, tried to signal for help, tried to comfort each other as their air slowly ran out. Dr. Santos found evidence that Amanda Thompson had managed to keep the children calm. For hours, maybe even days, she'd led them in songs. The investigators found paper with song lyrics written in her handwriting. She'd distributed the snacks meant for their museum visit, rationing them to last as long as possible. She'd held each frightened child, whispering comfort as their world grew darker and their air grew thinner. The final message, carved deep into the metal near Amanda's seat, was the most heartbreaking. I tried to save them. I'm sorry I failed. The discovery of the bus reignited the investigation with a fury. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It was mass murder, the most heinous crime in Iowa's history. Retired Detective Sarah Montgomery, now 68, returned to lead the investigation. She'd never forgotten the missing bus, never stopped wondering what had happened to those children. Now she knew, and the knowledge filled her with a rage she'd never experienced in 30 years of police work. Whoever did this planned it meticulously, she told the assembled task force. They didn't just bury a bus. They built an underground chamber. They had excavation equipment, concrete, time. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was calculated. The forensics team began processing the bus inch by inch. They found fingerprints that didn't belong to the victims, DNA evidence on the chains that had secured the doors. Most importantly, they found something that broke the case wide open. A business card wedged deep under the driver's seat. Kowalski Construction and Excavation, the same last name as Pete Kowalski, the diner owner who'd conveniently repainted his bathroom the day after Amanda's sister found the message. Within hours, police were at Pete Kowalski's door with a warrant. They found him in his kitchen, shaking, hands wrapped around a coffee cup, as if he'd been expecting them for 18 years. "I never meant for it to happen," were his first words. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt." But Pete Kowalski wasn't the mastermind. He was just another victim of the real monster. Pete Kowalski's confession opened a doorway to hell. Through tears and trembling words, he told investigators about his older brother, Vincent Kowalski, a man whose darkness had terrorized Pete's entire life. Vincent had been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder as a teenager, but in 1970s rural Illinois, that diagnosis meant little. He'd bounced between mental institutions and prison, always managing to charm his way out of long-term consequences. He was intelligent, manipulative, and completely devoid of empathy. Vinny was always talking about the perfect crime, Pete told Detective Montgomery. He said he wanted to prove he was smarter than the police, smarter than the FBI. He'd study kidnapping cases, murder cases, figuring out where people went wrong. In 1989, Vincent had been living in a trailer on Pete's property, supposedly helping with the family construction business. But Vincent had been planning something else entirely. He became obsessed with those special kids, Pete continued, his voice barely above a whisper. He said they were perfect because nobody would believe them if they tried to tell anyone what happened. He said their families would be so grateful to get them back. They'd never ask hard questions. Vincent's plan was elaborate and sick. He'd been following the school bus for weeks, learning the routes, timing the trips. He knew about the museum field trip because he'd overheard Amanda Thompson discussing it at a teacher's supply store. On the morning of October 15th, Vincent followed the bus until it reached a remote stretch of highway he'd chosen carefully. Using a stolen police cruiser he'd modified to look authentic, he'd pulled the bus over, claiming there was a mechanical problem that needed to be checked. Jerry Martinez, being a law-abiding citizen, had complied. Vincent had approached the bus wearing a fake police uniform, speaking calmly to avoid frightening the children. "Officer Smith," he'd introduced himself to Amanda. "I need you to follow me to a secure location while we sort this out, for everyone's safety." What Amanda didn't know was that Vincent had spent months preparing an underground chamber on a piece of abandoned farmland. Using Pete's construction equipment, he'd excavated a massive hole, reinforced it with concrete walls, and created what he called his playroom. "He told me it was for storing equipment," Pete sobbed. "I helped him build it. God forgive me. I helped him build their tomb." Vincent had led the bus to the farmland and convinced Amanda and Jerry that they needed to drive into what appeared to be a large garage for safety reasons. Once inside, metal doors had slammed shut behind them. What happened next was too horrific for Pete to recount without breaking down completely. Vincent hadn't planned to kill them immediately. He'd wanted to play with them first. For 3 days, he'd kept them in the underground chamber, subjecting them to psychological torture. He'd convinced the children that their families had abandoned them, that they were never going home. He'd told Amanda that the parents blamed her for what happened, that she was a failure as a teacher. But Amanda Thompson had been stronger than Vincent anticipated. Despite her terror, she'd continued to comfort the children, continued to fight for them, continued to look for ways to escape. On the 3rd night, she'd almost succeeded. Using a loose piece of metal from the bus, Amanda had managed to partially break the chain on the doors. She'd been quietly working on it for hours while Vincent slept, planning to lead the children to safety. Vincent had woken up and caught her in the act. That's when he decided to end it, Pete whispered. He was furious that she'd almost outsmarted him. He said if he couldn't have his fun, then nobody would ever find them. Vincent had chained the doors securely, started the excavator, and begun burying the bus with everyone still alive inside. Pete had begged him to stop, had threatened to call the police. He said if I told anyone, he'd tell them I helped plan it, Pete continued. He said my fingerprints were on the construction equipment. My name was on the land deed. He said nobody would believe I was innocent. So Pete had stayed silent for 18 years, carrying the weight of 10 deaths on his conscience while his brother disappeared into the night. Vincent Kowalski had vanished after the murders, but he hadn't gone far. Using fake identities he'd been crafting for years, he'd moved around the Midwest, always staying one step ahead of any investigation that might connect him to his crimes. But Vincent hadn't stopped killing. As the FBI dug into his background, they uncovered a trail of missing persons cases across 5 states, all bearing his signature: vulnerable victims, elaborate planning, and bodies that were never found. A group of developmentally disabled adults who disappeared from a care facility in Wisconsin in 1992. A deaf child who'd vanished from a school playground in Minnesota in 1995. An elderly man with dementia who'd walked away from a nursing home in Michigan in 1998. All had disappeared without a trace. All had been in Vincent's vicinity when they'd gone missing. We're dealing with a serial killer who specifically targets the most vulnerable members of society, FBI profiler Dr. James Harrison told the task force. He chooses victims who can't fight back, can't adequately communicate what's happening to them, and whose disappearances might be attributed to their conditions rather than foul play. The FBI issued a nationwide manhunt for Vincent Kowalski, now 61 years old. His last known alias was Vincent Kent, and he'd been working as a maintenance supervisor at a care facility for disabled adults in Tennessee. When police arrived at the facility, they found Vincent's apartment empty, but what they discovered there made everyone's blood run cold. Detailed floor plans of the facility, photographs of residents, a notebook filled with observations about which victims would be easiest to take and which would be missed the least. Vincent had been planning another mass killing. The manhunt for Vincent Kowalski became one of the largest in FBI history. His photograph was plastered on every news channel, every website, every law enforcement bulletin across the country. But Vincent was smart. He'd been evading capture for decades, and he wasn't about to make it easy now. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: social media. A woman named Tracy Mills in Phoenix, Arizona, was scrolling through Facebook when she saw Vincent's photo on a shared post about the manhunt. She recognized him immediately, not as Vincent Kowalski or Vincent Kent, but as Mr. Victor, the kind janitor at her son's special needs school. Tracy's son, David, had autism and limited verbal communication. But in recent weeks, he'd been having nightmares, waking up screaming about the bad man at school. David kept saying Mr. Victor scary and refusing to go to school. Tracy had attributed it to anxiety. David often struggled with changes in routine, but seeing Vincent's photo, she realized her son had been trying to warn her. David has been terrified for weeks, Tracy told the FBI agents who rushed to Phoenix. He keeps drawing pictures of a man in a basement with children. I thought they were just nightmares, but what if he was seeing something real? The Phoenix FBI office surrounded Sunset Canyon Elementary School while classes were in session. They found Vincent Kowalski exactly where Tracy said he'd be, in the basement maintenance area. where he'd been building another underground chamber, beneath the school. But Vincent wasn't alone. When FBI agents breached the school's basement, they found Vincent standing in a partially constructed concrete room, holding a 7-year-old girl with Down syndrome. The child, Emma Rodriguez, had been reported missing from her classroom 30 minutes earlier. "I've been waiting for you," Vincent said calmly, a twisted smile playing on his lips. "I was wondering how long it would take." Agent Lisa Chen, who was leading the tactical team, kept her weapon trained on Vincent while trying to assess the situation. Emma appeared unharmed but terrified, her small body shaking in Vincent's arms. "Let the child go, Vincent," Agent Chen said. "This ends now." Vincent laughed, a chilling sound that echoed off the concrete walls of his half-built torture chamber. "End? This is just the beginning. Do you have any idea how many like her I've taken over the years? How many perfect little victims who couldn't tell anyone what I did to them?" As he spoke, Vincent slowly backed toward a dark corner of the room, where agents could see he'd been constructing something. Metal restraints bolted to the wall, a drainage system in the floor, soundproofing materials stacked nearby. "The bus children were just practice," Vincent continued, his voice taking on a sick pride. "Amanda Thompson thought she was so smart, so protective, but she couldn't save them, just like this one's teacher can't save her." Agent Chen realized Vincent was trying to provoke them into taking a shot he could use as cover to disappear into the maze of tunnels he'd clearly been digging beneath the school. She made a split-second decision. "Tell me about Amanda," she said, lowering her weapon slightly. "Tell me what really happened in that bus." Vincent's eyes lit up with the opportunity to relive his crime. Amanda was beautiful when she finally broke. For 2 days, she tried to be strong for those little freaks, singing to them, telling them stories, promising them they'd go home. But on the 3rd night, when I explained what I was really going to do to each of them, he never finished the sentence. 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez, despite her Down syndrome, despite her terror, despite being in the grip of a monster, proved she was braver than anyone could have imagined. She bit down hard on Vincent's hand and broke free, running straight toward Agent Chen. Vincent roared in pain and rage, lunging after Emma. That split second was all Agent Chen needed. Her shot hit Vincent in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into his half-built torture chamber. As other agents swarmed to secure Vincent and comfort Emma, Agent Chen noticed something that made her stomach turn. Carved into the concrete wall of Vincent's new chamber, in fresh letters that looked like they'd been scratched with a nail or piece of metal, was a message. AT was here. The message carved into the wall of Vincent's Phoenix chamber sent shockwaves through the investigation. AT was here appeared to be written in the same style as the desperate messages found in the buried school bus 18 years earlier. But Amanda Thompson had died in that bus. How could her initials be in a chamber that Vincent was building in 2007? The answer came from Vincent himself during his interrogation. With his shoulder bandaged and his decades of freedom over, Vincent seemed almost relieved to finally tell someone about his masterpiece. Amanda was special, he told Agent Chen, as cameras recorded every word. "Most of my victims break quickly. They accept their fate, beg for mercy, give up hope. But Amanda kept fighting, even when I told her exactly what I was going to do to each of those children. She kept planning, kept looking for ways to escape." Vincent's voice took on an admiring tone that made Agent Chen's skin crawl. "She carved that message in the bus on the last night, using a piece of broken glass she'd hidden in her pocket. AT was here." Like she was claiming the space, refusing to be forgotten. But Vincent's obsession with Amanda hadn't ended when he buried the bus. "I've been carving her initials into every chamber I build," he continued. "She was the one who got away, you see. Not physically. I made sure she died with the rest of them. But mentally. She never surrendered. She never let me break her spirit." The FBI realized they were dealing with something even more twisted than they'd imagined. Vincent hadn't just been killing victims over the past 18 years. He'd been building shrines to Amanda Thompson, recreating their underground prison over and over again, carving her initials into each new torture chamber as if trying to recapture the one victim who'd refused to give him the satisfaction of complete defeat. With Vincent in custody, the FBI began the grim task of tracking down his other victims. Using the aliases he'd admitted to, the locations where he'd worked, and the timeline he provided during interrogation, they started connecting disappearances across multiple states. The Wisconsin care facility case broke first. Vincent had worked there as a night security guard in 1992, when 6 residents with developmental disabilities had vanished during what was officially classified as a fire evacuation gone wrong. The facility had burned down that same night, and the bodies were never recovered. There was no fire, Vincent told investigators with chilling matter-of-factness. I set a small blaze in the kitchen to trigger the evacuation alarm, then led my chosen group to what I told them was a safety shelter. By the time anyone realized they were missing, I'd already moved them to a chamber I'd built in the woods. Vincent described how he'd kept the 6 victims alive for weeks in his underground prison, studying their behaviors, testing their limits, documenting their psychological deterioration. When he grew bored with them, he'd killed them and carefully disposed of their bodies. "Where are they now?" Agent Chen demanded. Vincent smiled. "Fish food. I weighted them down and dropped them in Lake Michigan. They've been feeding the ecosystem for 15 years now." Similar confessions followed for cases in Minnesota, Michigan, and Ohio. Vincent had been moving systematically across the Midwest, taking jobs at schools, care facilities, and hospitals, anywhere he could access vulnerable populations. But the most shocking revelation came when Vincent started talking about his early work. "The bus wasn't my first," he said. "It was just my largest. I'd been practicing for years." Vincent's practice runs had begun in the early 1980s, when he was still living with his brother Pete. He'd started small, individual victims who wouldn't be immediately missed. Homeless people at first, he told investigators. Addicts, prostitutes, runaways, people who lived on the margins. I'd offer them food, shelter, a warm place to sleep. Then I'd test how long I could keep them before they died. But Vincent had quickly grown bored with adult victims. They were too easy to break. No challenge. I wanted subjects who would fight back, who would give me a real game. That's when he'd started targeting children with disabilities. Their minds work differently, he explained with clinical detachment. They process fear and trauma in unique ways. Some become completely catatonic. Others develop elaborate fantasy worlds to escape the reality of their situation. A few, like Amanda, become almost superhuman in their determination to survive. Vincent's first child victim had been in 1985, a 9-year-old boy with autism, who'd wandered away from a church picnic. The boy's disappearance had been attributed to his condition. Everyone assumed he'd simply gotten lost and died of exposure in the woods. "Timothy," Vincent said, his eyes growing distant. "He lasted 3 weeks in my first real chamber. Kept drawing pictures on the walls with pieces of charcoal, even when I told him to stop. Beautiful artwork, actually. Very detailed. I almost felt bad when I had to end it." The FBI realized they were looking at a crime spree that spanned over 2 decades and potentially dozens of victims. Vincent had been hiding in plain sight, working in positions that gave him access to the most vulnerable members of society, while building an underground empire of torture chambers across the Midwest. But Vincent's biggest revelation was yet to come. As Vincent continued his confessions, investigators began to understand that he hadn't been working alone. Over the years, he'd cultivated a network of accomplices, people like his brother Pete, who were too frightened, too compromised, or too twisted to resist helping him. "You think I built all those chambers by myself?" Vincent laughed. "You think I moved bodies, transported victims, managed multiple sites across 5 states without help?" He began naming names. Contractors who'd helped with excavation, truck drivers who'd transported victims, even a few law enforcement officers who'd been paid to look the other way when certain missing persons cases got too close to the truth. "The beautiful thing about targeting disabled victims," Vincent explained, "is that society already considers them disposable. Half the time, when they disappear, people assume they wandered off or had an accident. The investigations are half-hearted, at best." But Vincent's most chilling revelation was about his future plans. In the Phoenix chamber where he'd been captured, investigators found detailed blueprints for what he called the final project, a massive underground complex that would have housed dozens of victims simultaneously. I was tired of the small-scale operations, he said. I wanted to create something permanent, a place where I could study my subjects for months, years even, where I could document their psychological deterioration from beginning to end. The blueprints showed multiple chambers, each designed for different types of victim, soundproof rooms for those who screamed, padded cells for those who hurt themselves, observation areas where Vincent could watch and record everything that happened. Sunset Canyon Elementary was just the first phase, he continued. I'd already identified 17 students who would have made perfect subjects. Children with autism, Down syndrome, cerebral palsy. Conditions that would have made their testimonies unreliable if they'd ever been found. Agent Chen felt sick as she realized how close Vincent had come to succeeding. If Tracy Mills hadn't recognized his photograph, if her son David hadn't been brave enough to keep trying to warn her about the bad man, Vincent might have completed his underground complex and begun the largest mass kidnapping in American history. The trial of Vincent Kowalski became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in decades. Families of victims flew in from across the country to see justice served. Amanda Thompson's sister Rebecca, now a grandmother herself, sat in the front row every day, wearing a small pin with Amanda's photograph. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Michael Harrison, painted a picture of a monster who had spent decades preying on society's most vulnerable members. They presented evidence of Vincent's crimes spanning from 1985 to 2007, over 20 years of systematic torture and murder. But it was the testimony about the school bus that brought the courtroom to tears. Dr. Maria Santos, the FBI forensics specialist who had recovered the bus, described in heartbreaking detail the evidence of Amanda Thompson's final hours. The songs she'd written to keep the children calm, the way she'd distributed their snacks to last as long as possible, the protective position she'd died in, her arms wrapped around Marcus Williams as if trying to shield him from their terrible fate. Miss Thompson never stopped being a teacher, Dr. Santos testified. Even facing her own death, her primary concern was protecting and comforting her students. She died as she lived, putting her children first. Margaret Williams, Marcus's mother, took the stand to speak about her son. Now in her 60s, she still kept his room exactly as he'd left it, his backup red truck sitting on the dresser. Marcus would have been 26 now, she said through tears. He would have needed care his whole life, but he would have been loved his whole life. Vincent Kowalski didn't just kill 8 children and 2 adults. He stole decades of love, of growth, of small victories and quiet moments. He stole their futures. Vincent showed no emotion throughout the trial. He sat quietly, occasionally taking notes, as if he were observing an interesting experiment rather than his own murder trial. The defense tried to argue that Vincent suffered from severe mental illness, that his crimes were the result of an untreated personality disorder exacerbated by childhood trauma. But the prosecution countered with evidence of Vincent's careful planning, his ability to hold jobs and maintain relationships, his deliberate targeting of vulnerable victims. This defendant didn't kill because he was sick, Ada Harrison argued. In his closing statement, he killed because he enjoyed it. He chose victims who couldn't fight back, not because of mental illness, but because he was a coward who got pleasure from others' suffering. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman's voice was steady, but filled with emotion as she read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Vincent Kowalski was sentenced to death for the murders of the 10 bus victims, with additional life sentences for his other confirmed kills. As the judge read the sentence, Vincent finally showed emotion. He smiled. The conviction brought some measure of closure to the families, but the real healing had begun months earlier, during the investigation itself. The discovery of the bus had finally given them answers. More importantly, it had given them back their loved ones. Amanda Thompson was buried with full honors, hundreds of former students and fellow teachers attending her funeral. The 8 children were laid to rest in a special section of Cedar Falls Memorial Cemetery, their graves arranged in a semicircle with Amanda's and Jerry Martinez's graves at the center. One last-class photo, eternal and peaceful. But the most healing moment came from an unexpected source. During the excavation of the bus, investigators had found something they initially dismissed as insignificant: A small digital camera wedged under one of the seats. The camera had been damaged by 18 years underground, but FBI tech specialists were able to recover some of its memory. The camera had belonged to Amanda Thompson. She'd brought it to document the field trip, to capture happy memories for the children's family. Most of the photos were corrupted beyond repair, but 3 images survived. Pictures Amanda had taken during the first few minutes after Vincent had forced them into the underground chamber, before she realized the true horror of their situation. The photos showed the children still believing they were safe. Marcus Williams holding his red truck, smiling at the camera. Emma Chen carefully arranging her colored pencils on the bus seat. Tyler Brooks pointing out the window, saying something about the address. In the last recoverable photo, all 8 children were gathered around Amanda, their faces bright with trust and affection, as their teacher prepared to take a group selfie. It was a moment of pure innocence, captured just before their world turned dark. The families treasured these final images. They were reminders that their loved ones' last conscious moments hadn't been filled with terror. They'd been filled with love, surrounded by people who cared about them. The Amanda Thompson Foundation was established 6 months after Vincent's conviction. The foundation's mission was to improve safety protocols for special needs students and to provide support for families affected by violence against disabled individuals. Rebecca Thompson, Amanda's sister, left her nursing career to run the foundation full-time. Amanda spent her life protecting vulnerable children, Rebecca said at the foundation's launch. This is how we continue her work. The foundation's first initiative was lobbying for improved communication systems on school buses. GPS tracking, panic buttons, and regular check-in protocols were implemented in school districts across Iowa and eventually adopted nationwide. They also established the Amanda Thompson Scholarship for special education teachers, ensuring that future educators would receive the training and support Amanda never had the chance to complete. But perhaps the foundation's most important work was something Amanda herself would have appreciated, giving voice to victims who couldn't speak for themselves. The foundation created a database of missing persons with disabilities, connecting families across the country who were searching for lost loved ones. They worked with law enforcement to improve investigation protocols and trained advocates to ensure disabled victims received the attention their cases deserved. Amanda taught us that every person has value, Rebecca explained to a room full of donors and volunteers. She died protecting children that society too often overlooks. We honor her by making sure no one is ever overlooked again. 3 years. After Vincent's conviction, construction workers building a new shopping center in rural Wisconsin made a discovery that provided closure for one more family. Deep beneath what was once the burned-out shell of the Willowbrook Care Facility, they found another underground chamber. Inside were the remains of 6 individuals, the residents who had disappeared during the fire evacuation in 1992. Unlike the school bus, this chamber told a different story. Vincent had kept these victims alive for weeks, just as he'd confessed. The walls were covered with scratched messages, drawings, and what appeared to be a calendar system marking the passage of days. But among the tragic evidence, investigators found something remarkable: a journal. One of the victims, a 28-year-old man named David Reeves, who had been born with intellectual disabilities, had somehow managed to document their captivity. Using a pencil he'd hidden from Vincent, David had written day-by-day accounts of their imprisonment, their attempts to escape, and their efforts to care for each other. The journal entries were simple but powerful. Day 3. Sarah is scared. I told her we will go home soon. Vincent is mean, but we are strong together. Day 8. Made up a game to make everyone laugh. Even Tommy smiled today. Games help us not think about bad things. Day 15. Vincent says, we will never leave. I don't believe him. Someone will find us. Someone always finds us when we are lost. Day 22. Getting very tired. Hard to write. Want to tell families we tried to be brave. We tried to take care of each other. The final entry was written in increasingly shaky handwriting. Day 24. Sarah died today. She was sleeping and didn't wake up. We are very sad, but we sang her favorite song. I want my mom to know I remembered everything she taught me about being kind. I tried to be kind, even when Vincent was mean. Please tell her I was good. David's journal provided investigators with crucial details about Vincent's methods and helped solve several other missing persons cases. But more than that, it showed the world that Vincent's victims weren't just passive sufferers. They were human beings who loved, hoped, and cared for each other, even in their darkest moments. David's mother, Linda Reeves, wept as investigators read her son's final words to her. "He was good," she whispered. "My David was so very good." Vincent Kowalski spent 4 years on death row, filing appeal after appeal, granting interviews to criminal psychologists, and maintaining detailed correspondence with other serial killers. He seemed to relish the attention, often describing his crimes in letters that were intercepted by prison officials. But in 2011, Vincent's appeals ran out. His execution date was set for October 15th, exactly 22 years after he had buried the school bus. The families of his victims were divided on whether to attend. Some wanted to see justice finally served. Others felt that witnessing Vincent's death would only give him more power over their lives. Margaret Williams decided to attend. At 73, she was frail, but determined. "I want to be there when it's over," she told reporters. "I want to look him in the eye one last time and let him know that we survived. We're still here, and Marcus's memory is still alive." The execution was scheduled for 6 p.m. As Vincent was strapped to the gurney and the IV was inserted, he was given the opportunity to make a final statement. Everyone expected him to show remorse, to apologize, to finally acknowledge the pain he'd caused. Instead, Vincent Kowalski looked directly at the viewing window where Margaret Williams sat and smiled. "I want you to know," he said, his voice calm and clear, "that I remember every moment, every scream, every tear, every desperate prayer for rescue that never came. And I want you to know that I'm not sorry. They got what they deserved for being weak." Margaret Williams stood up, her aged hands gripping the window ledge, and spoke, words that could be heard through the glass. "And you're getting what you deserve for being evil." The execution proceeded without incident. At 6:17 p.m. on October 15, 2011, Vincent Kowalski was pronounced dead. On the 10th anniversary of the bus discovery, the city of Cedar Falls unveiled a memorial in Riverside Park. The memorial consisted of 10 small bronze statues arranged in a circle. 8 children, their teacher, and their bus driver, all holding hands in an eternal bond of protection and love. At the center of the circle was a bronze school bus, its doors open, with the inscription, "They were going to learn about the wonders of the world. Instead, they taught us about the wonder of love." Each statue bore the name and photograph of one of the victims, along with a personal message from their family. Marcus Williams. He saw beauty in small things and brought joy wherever he went. Emma. She organized her world with precision and care, teaching us the value of order in chaos. Tyler Brooks. He remembered every address, every phone number, every important detail. He never forgot, and we never will. Sarah Mitchell. She loved horses and dreamed of riding them across open fields. Daniel Rodriguez. He collected rocks and knew the name of every dinosaur. Jamie Patterson. She could draw anything she saw and helped others see beauty too. Lisa White. She hummed constantly and filled every room with music. Kevin Murphy. He gave the best hugs and made everyone feel loved. Amanda Thompson. She protected her students until her last breath and taught us that love is stronger than Jerry Martinez. He drove safely, spoke kindly, and made every journey an adventure. The memorial dedication was attended by hundreds of people, including many of Amanda's former students who had grown into adults. They shared stories of how she had touched their lives, how her patience and understanding had helped them navigate a world that often didn't understand their needs. Rebecca Thompson, now in her 60s, spoke on behalf of all the family. These 10 people didn't die in vain if we remember what they taught us. They taught us that every life has value. They taught us that love persists even in the darkest places. They taught us that we must protect the vulnerable, speak for the voiceless, and never, ever give up hope. The Amanda Thompson case changed how law enforcement approached missing persons cases involving individuals with disabilities. Training programs were implemented nationwide, teaching officers to take these disappearances seriously from the first moment they're reported. The Thompson Protocol became standard procedure. Immediate activation of search resources, specialized interviewing techniques for disabled witnesses, and coordination between agencies to prevent cases from falling through jurisdictional cracks. Dr. Maria Santos, the FBI forensics specialist who had recovered the bus, became a leading expert on crimes against disabled individuals. She traveled the country training investigators and speaking at conferences about the unique challenges these cases present. Vincent Kowalski wasn't an anomaly, she would tell audience. He was just more organized than most predators who target vulnerable populations. There are others out there, and we have to be vigilant. Her words proved prophetic. In the years following Vincent's conviction, law enforcement agencies using the Thompson Protocol uncovered several other cases of systematic abuse and murder targeting disabled individuals. The increased awareness and improved investigation techniques led to dozens of arrests and convictions. 10 years after Vincent's execution, an unexpected visitor arrived at Margaret Williams's door. It was Pete Kowalski, Vincent's brother, now in his 70s and using a walker to get around. Margaret hadn't seen him since the trial, where he had testified against his brother in exchange for a reduced sentence. Pete had served 5 years, in prison for his role in concealing Vincent's crime. "I know I have no right to be here," Pete said, his voice trembling as Margaret opened her door. "I know you must hate me for what I helped him do." Margaret studied the broken man standing on her porch. Age and guilt had ravaged him. His hands shook constantly, a condition that had developed during his imprisonment. His eyes, once shifty and evasive, now held only pain and regret. "I think about Marcus every day," Pete continued, "about all of them. I see their faces in my dreams. I know saying I'm sorry doesn't change anything, but I needed you to hear it from me. I'm sorry I was too weak to stop him. I'm sorry I let fear control me. I'm sorry I helped him hurt your boy." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Considering the man who had helped seal her son's fate, she thought about the rage she'd carried for 23 years, the hatred that had consumed so much of her life. "Come in," she said finally, stepping aside. "I'll make us some tea." They sat in Margaret's living room, surrounded by photos of Marcus at every age from birth to 8. Pete wept as he looked at them. This happy, innocent child whose life he had helped destroy. "Tell me about the man Vincent was before he became a monster," Margaret said quietly. "Help me understand how this happened." For 3 hours, Pete shared stories of his brother's childhood, the signs everyone had missed, the gradual escalation from cruelty to animals to assault on neighborhood children. He painted a picture of a family in denial, a mental health system that failed, and a society that looked the other way. "I was afraid of him," Pete admitted. "I'd been afraid of him since we were children, but that's no excuse. I should have been more afraid of becoming like him." When Pete finally left, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. Peace, not forgiveness, exactly, but an absence of the corrosive anger that had been eating her alive. "Marcus wouldn't want me to hate," she said to her son's photograph that night. "He had such a gentle heart. He would want me to find peace." Amanda Thompson's influence extended far beyond her death. Many of her former students, inspired by her memory, chose careers in special education, social work, and disability advocacy. One of them was Jennifer Morrison, who had been in Amanda's class. The year before the tragedy occurred, Jennifer, who had autism herself, became a special education teacher and eventually opened a school specifically designed for children with developmental disabilities. "Miss Thompson saw potential in every student," Jennifer explained during a television interview on the 25th anniversary of the disappearance. "She didn't see disabilities, she saw different abilities. She taught us that we weren't broken, we were just differently made." The Amanda Thompson School for Exceptional Children opened in 2014, built on the site of the old Riverside Elementary. The school's innovative programs and inclusive philosophy attracted national attention, with educators from around the world coming to study their method. The school's main hallway featured a wall of photos showing Amanda with her students over the years, but the most powerful image was a drawing made by one of her former students. It showed Amanda surrounded by angels, all of whom had the faces of children with disabilities. Beneath the drawing was a quote that had been found in Amanda's teaching journal, discovered in her apartment after her death. Every child is a universe waiting to be explored. Our job isn't to change them. It's to help them discover the stars inside themselves. The story of the vanishing field trip became more than just a true crime case. It became a testament to the power of love over evil, of hope over despair, of light over darkness. The underground chamber where Vincent Kowalski had buried 10 innocent people had been filled with concrete and turned into a memorial garden. Families came from around the world to visit the site, to pay their respects, and to remember that even in the darkest places, love persists. 25 years after that, October morning in 1989, the field trip that was supposed to last one day had become a journey that changed countless lives. Amanda Thompson's 8 students never made it to the Museum of Science and Industry, but they taught the world something more valuable than any exhibit could provide. They taught us that every life matters, that every person deserves protection, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are those who die trying to save others. The yellow school bus that disappeared without a trace had been found at last. But more importantly, the love and dedication of a teacher who refused to abandon her students, even in death, had created a legacy that would protect vulnerable children for generations to come. In the end, Vincent Kowalski got what he wanted. He was remembered, but not as the brilliant criminal he thought himself to be. He was remembered as a monster who was ultimately defeated by the very people he thought were weak. Amanda Thompson, Marcus Williams, Emma Chen, Tyler Brooks, Sarah Mitchell, Daniel Rodriguez, Jamie Patterson, Lisa Wang, Kevin Murphy, and Jerry Martinez. Their names are carved in bronze, their stories are told in schools. Their legacy lives on in every child who is protected because people refuse to forget. The field trip that began in tragedy ended in triumph. Not because evil was defeated. Evil always finds new forms. But because love proved stronger than hate. Because courage proved greater than cowardice. And because 10 people who died trying to take care of each other taught the world what it really means to be human. Their journey to the museum ended underground, in darkness and despair. But their real destination was always something greater. They went to teach us about the wonders of the human spirit, the power of selfless love, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us all. The field trip that lasted 25 years finally brought them home.